Genesis 50, verse 6. And Pharaoh said, "We have seen that Joseph adopts a middle course, for he was not willing utterly to fail in his duty. Yet, by catching at a pretext founded on the command of his father, he did not conduct himself with sufficient firmness." It is possible that Pharaoh was inclined, by the modesty of his manner, more easily to assent to his requests. Yet this cowardice is not, on this account, so sanctioned that the sons of God are at liberty to indulge themselves in it, for if they intrepidly follow where duty calls, the Lord will give the issue which is desired, beyond all expectation. For, although, humanly speaking, Joseph's bland submission succeeded prosperously, it is nevertheless certain that the proud mind of the king was influenced by God to concede thus benignantly what had been desired. It is also to be observed, what great respect for an oath prevailed among blind unbelievers. For, though Pharaoh himself had not sworn, he still deemed it unlawful for him to violate, by his own authority, the pledge given by another. But at this day, reverence for God has become so far extinct, that men commonly regard it as a mere trifle to deceive, on one side or another, under the name of God. But such unbridled license, which even Pharaoh himself denounces, shall not escape the judgment of God with impunity. Verse 7. And Joseph went up. Moses gives a full account of the burial. What he relates concerning the renewed mourning of Joseph and his brethren, as well as of the Egyptians, ought by no means to be established as a rule among ourselves. For we know, that since our flesh has no self-government, men commonly exceed bounds both in sorrowing and in rejoicing. The tumultuous glamour, which the inhabitants of the place admired, cannot be excused. And although Joseph had a right end in view, when he fixed the mourning to last through 7 successive days, yet this excess was not free from blame. Nevertheless, it was not without reason that the Lord caused this funeral to be thus honorably celebrated, for it was of great consequence that a kind of sublime trophy should be raised, which might transmit to posterity the memory of Jacob's faith. If he had been buried privately, and in a common manner, his fame would soon have been extinguished. But now, unless men willfully blind themselves, they have continually before their eyes a noble example, which may cherish the hope of the promised inheritance. They perceive, as it were, the standard of the deliverance erected, which shall take place in the fullness of time. Wherefore, we are not here to consider the honor of the deceased so much as the benefit of the living. Even the Egyptians, not knowing what they do, bear a torch before the Israelites, to teach them to keep the course of their divine calling. The Canaanites do the same, when they distinguish the place by a new name. For hence it came to pass that the knowledge of the covenant of the Lord flourished afresh. Genesis 50 verse 14. And Joseph returned. Although Joseph and the rest had left so many pledges in Egypt, that it would be necessary for them to return, it is yet probable that they were rather drawn back thither by the oracle of God. For God never permitted them to choose an abode at their own will. But as he had before led Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in their journeying, so he held their sons shut up in the land of Goshen, as within barriers. And there is no doubt that the Holy Fathers left that oracle which we have in the 15th chapter and the 13th verse, Genesis 15:13 to their sons, to be kept in faithful custody as a precious treasure. For they return, therefore, into Egypt, not only because they were compelled by present necessity, but because it was not lawful for them to shake off with the hand the yoke which God had put upon their necks. But if the Lord does not hold all men bound by voluntary obedience to himself, he nevertheless holds their minds by his secret rein, that they may not withdraw themselves from his government. Nor can we form any other conjecture than that they were restrained by his fear, so that even when admonished of the tyrannical oppression which was coming upon them, they did not attempt to make their escape. We know that their disposition was not so mild as to prevent them from rebelling against lighter burdens. Wherefore, on this point, a special sense of religious obligation subdued them, so that they prepared themselves quietly and silently to endure the hardest servitude. Verse 15. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, Moses who relates, that the sons of Jacob, after the death of their father, were apprehensive lest Joseph should take vengeance for the injury they had done him. And whence this fear? But because they formed their judgment of him according to their own disposition. That they had found him so placable they do not attribute to true piety towards God, nor do they account it a special gift of the Spirit, but rather, they imagine that, out of respect to his father alone, he had hitherto been so far restrained, as barely to postpone his revenge. But, By such perverse judgment, they do a great injury to one who, by the liberality of his treatment, had borne them witness that his mind was free from all hatred and malevolence. Part of the injurious surmise reflected even upon God, whose special grace had shone forth in the moderation of Joseph. Hence, however, we gather that guilty consciences are so disturbed by blind and unreasonable fears that they stumble in broad daylight. Joseph had absolved his brethren from the crime they had committed against him, but they are so agitated by guilty compunctions that they voluntarily become their own tormentors. And they have not themselves to thank that they did not bring down upon themselves the very punishment which had been remitted, because the mind of Joseph might well have been wounded by their distrust. For, what could they mean by still malignantly suspecting him to whose compassion they had again and again owed their lives? Yet I do not doubt that long ago they had repented of their wickedness, but, perhaps, because they had not yet been sufficiently purified, the Lord suffered them to be tortured with anxiety and trouble, first, to make them approve to others that an evil conscience is its own tormentor, and, then, to humble them under a renewed sense of their own guilt. For, when they regard themselves as obnoxious to their brother's judgment, they cannot forget, unless they are worse than senseless, the celestial tribunal of God. What Solomon says, we see daily fulfilled, that the wicked flee when no man persuadeth. Proverbs 28:1. Winking. But, in this way, God compels the fugitives to give up their account. They would desire, in their supine torpor, to deceive both God and men, and they bring upon their minds, as far as they are able, the callousness of obstinacy. In the meantime, whether they will or no, they are made to tremble at the sound of a falling leaf, lest their carnal security should obliterate their sense of the judgment of God. Leviticus 26:36. Nothing is more desirable than a tranquil mind. While God deprives the wicked of this singular benefit, which is desired by all, he invites us to cultivate integrity. But especially, seeing that the patriarchs, who were already affected with penitence for their wickedness, are yet thus severely awakened, a long time afterwards, let none of us yield to self-indulgence. But let each diligently examine himself, lest hypocrisy should inwardly cherish the secret stings of the wrath of God. And may that happy peace, which can find no place in a double heart, shine within our thoroughly purified breasts. For this due reward of their neglect remains for all those who do not draw nigh to God sincerely and with all their heart, that they are compelled to stand before the judgment seat of mortal man. Wherefore, there is no other method which can free us from disquietude, but that of returning into favor with God. Whosoever shall despise this remedy, shall be afraid not only of man, but also of a shadow, or a breath of wind. Verse 16. And they sent a messenger. Because they are ashamed themselves to speak, they engage messengers of peace, in whom Joseph might have greater confidence. But here also we perceive that they who have an accusing conscience are destitute of counsel and of reason. For if Jacob had been solicitous on this point, why did he not effect reconciliation between the son who was so obedient unto himself, and his brethren? Besides, for what reason should they attempt to do that through mediators, which they could do so much better in their own persons? The Lord, therefore, suffers them to act like children, that we, being instructed by their example, may look for no advantage from the use of frivolous inventions. But it may be asked, where the sons of Jacob found men to whom they could venture to commit such a message? For it was no light thing to make known their execrable crime to strangers, and it would have been folly to subject themselves to this infamy among the Egyptians. The most probable conjecture is, that some domestic witnesses were chosen from the number of their own servants. For though Moses makes no mention of such, when he relates that Jacob departed into Egypt, yet that some were brought with him, may easily be gathered from certain considerations. Verse 17. Forgive, I pray thee now. They do not dissemble the fact that they had grievously sinned, and they are so far from extenuating their fault, that they freely heap up words in charging themselves with guilt. They do not, therefore, ask that pardon should be granted them as if the offense were light, but they place in opposition to the atrocity of their crime, first, the authority of their father, and then the sacred name of God. Their confession would have been worthy of commendation, had they proceeded directly, and without tortuous contrivances, to appease their brother. Now, since they have drawn from the fountain of piety the instruction that it is right for sin to be remitted to the servants of God, we may receive it as a common exhortation, that if we have been injured by the members of the church, we must not be too rigid and immovable in pardoning the offense. This humanity indeed is generally enjoined upon us towards all men, but when the bond of religion is superated, we are harder than iron, if we are not inclined to the exercise of compassion. And we must observe, that they expressly mention the God of Jacob, because the peculiar faith and worship by which they were distinguished from the rest of the nations, ought to unite them with each other in a closer bond, as if God, who had adopted that family, stood forth in the midst of them as engaged to produce reconciliation. And Joseph wept when they spake unto him. It cannot be ascertained with certainty from the words of Moses, whether the brethren of Joseph were present, and were speaking, at the time he wept. Some interpreters imagine that a part was here acted designedly, so that when the mind of Joseph had been sounded by others, the brethren, soon afterwards, came in, during the discourse. I rather incline to a different opinion, namely, that, when he knew, from the messengers, that their minds were tormented, and they were troubling themselves in vain, he was moved with sympathy towards them. Then, having sent for them, he set them free from all care and fear. And their speech, when they themselves were deprecating his anger, drew forth his tears. Moreover, by thus affectionately weeping over the sorrow and anxiety of his brethren, he offers us a remarkable example of compassion. But if we have an arduous conflict with the impetuosity of an angry temper, or the obstinacy of a disposition to hatred, we must pray to the Lord for a spirit of meanness, the force of which manifests itself not less effectually, at this day, in the members of Christ, than formerly in Joseph.